Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Miles from Nowhere, A Round-the-World Bicycle Adventure by Barbara Savage. Narrated by Nan Mcnamara. Forward. Some books are passed on like a secret, pressed into your hands by someone who knows you. Here, read this. I think you'll like it. When the book delivers, it feels like a treasure. Something of value that you want to pass along to the next person who you think will appreciate it in the same way. Miles from Nowhere is one of those books. My copy was given to me when I was in my late 20s by a friend who knew I had an adventurous streak. The paperback he passed along was already battered, the corners soft and bent from being shoved in tote bags and backpacks, maybe also bicycle panniers. The book had already been loved by my friend and perhaps by others before him. My friend was right about this book. In this book, I found the sort of adventure story I craved, a journey that was not only athletic, but also emotional. The cycling was hard and physical. No one bikes the Alps, the Rockies, the Himalaya without great effort. But the book wasn't just about feats of strength or daring, as many adventure stories tend to be. That story would have gotten old quick. This was a book about people and the world, and experiencing both of those things in the most immediate way possible. I was 7 years old in 1978 when Barbara and Larry Savage set out on their around-the-world cycle adventure. Jimmy Carter was the U.S. president. The first Star Wars film had just captivated the world, and Mount St. Helens had not yet erupted. That spring, the young married couple in their late 20s set out on a bike trip that would ultimately span 23,000 miles and 25 countries over the next 2 years, from the desolate prairies of South Dakota and the deserts of Morocco to the mountains of Nepal and the teeming streets of Cairo, New Delhi, and Bangkok. It would change both of their lives. Biking around the world hadn't been their original plan. Barbara and Larry wanted to cycle across North America, then hop over to Europe and visit friends they had made while living in Barcelona. When they saw on the map how far they'd be, however, they decided to keep going. At first we said we'd take the train through the really boring parts, Larry Savage explains today. But I really wanted to cycle, so Barb put up with that. It was a little bone of contention between us, but she put up with it. Considering what their journey became, an often joyful trip that also included dysentery, bike accidents, and a harrowing night in Nepal spent riding on a dirt road with a sheer drop-off to one side and dead batteries that prevented any illumination to guide the way, it seems as though both Larry and Barbara were fully committed to the adventure. This is not the story of a wife following her husband around the globe. If that had been the case, it wouldn't have worked. They would have parted ways early on, as other cycling couples they met ultimately did. Barbara's love of cycling, newfound though it may have been, shines through in her words. We moved slow enough to see and hear things that to passing motorists were only blurs of color and sound. We took in the textures and odors of the soil and the vegetation. And because cycling is such a quiet mode of travel, wild animals weren't frightened away when we came up the road toward them. And, too, touring by bicycle made it easy for us to meet people. Whenever we stopped in a small town to pick up a snack or food supplies at the local country stores, people always hurried over to talk with us. Larry may have been the cyclist initially, but Barbara soon took it on as her own. This was one of the things about Miles from Nowhere that I responded to as a female reader. Here was a woman, being just as adventurous as the man, holding her own through rough and rugged travel. Sure, she got sick. They both did. And so did Jeff, the New Zealand cyclist they teamed up with through parts of Asia. But Barbara always seemed game for adventure, strong. She didn't scare easy. A photo of her in the Valley of the Kings, near Luxor, Egypt, surrounded by men in robes who tower over her small frame and bicycle, was such a striking one to me. Barbara went to places that were not expecting her, and she didn't back down. It made me want to be more like that myself. Barbara and Larry were not the first Western cyclists to explore the larger world and bring back their stories. Barbara wasn't even the first woman to embark on a long-distance cycling trip and then write about it. The Irish cyclist and author Dervla Murphy published her book Full Tilt about cycling from Ireland to India on her own in 1965. Her packing list notably included a flask of whiskey and a pistol. Both items proved useful. What makes Miles from Nowhere stand out, both when it was written and still today, is the genuine good nature with which the savages met the world. Over and over again, they were warned away, told the world was a scary and dangerous place. "You haven't been robbed yet?" a bank clerk in Thailand asked when they went to cash travelers' checks. "Oh, you will be." India was described by a traveling businessman as a bizarre and dangerous country. He was so concerned for Barbara's fate there that he gave her a Bible. "Keep this with you always in India," he warned. "You'll need it." Morocco was said to be equally dangerous. "You can never be too cautious with those crazy Moroccans," they were told. "They'll rob you and they'll slit your throat." Despite these warnings, and despite their own fears, Barbara and Larry went anyway. And in the process, they connected with people and had experiences otherwise unimaginable. They were looked after by communities, brought in from the cold, given food, accompanied by an armed Indian bandit who, instead of robbing them, clocked their speed and politely told them how fast they were cycling before roaring off on his motorcycle. Yes, there were tense interactions. There were rocks thrown at them in Egypt, and an encounter with one very angry Thai restaurant owner. But more often than not, humanity won out. "The best part of travel," says Larry Savage, "aside from seeing things, is meeting people and learning what their life is like, and seeing if you can work it out together." He insists that Barbara was the real connector. "She was better at it than I was. She was more accepting. But I am always willing to listen." This willingness and openness are the beating heart of the book. Larry says their uniqueness had a lot to do with how they were received. "We were a novelty," he explains. "Where we went, they hadn't seen many Westerners, and certainly not Westerners on bicycles. We were as entertaining to them as they were to us." Barbara and Larry were traveling at a time when two Caucasians appearing on bicycles in Africa and Asia was not only unexpected, but often a first for those who encountered them. Two foreigners, and especially a foreign woman, on bicycles with huge packs, will be one of the strangest sights those people have ever seen, they were told before venturing into rural Egypt. As a matter of fact, in some of the settlements, this year will quite probably be referred to in the future as the year when the fair-skinned aliens appeared, riding their bizarre bicycles. Their mode of transportation certainly softened the reception they received. On the road to Fes, for example, they met a policeman who could not believe they were Americans. "Americans travel only tour buses," he said. "But you bicycle. That good. Come, we help." The first time I read Miles from Nowhere, I realized something that has become only more evident with subsequent readings. This is a story about humanity. Though the savages' journey took them to stunning vistas and through stark and beautiful scenery, it was the people that ultimately made the biggest impression, both on Barbara and Larry and on the reader as well. When I think back on Barbara's stories, I remember the long days of cycling, but more than that, I remember the American cyclist who was sprouting his own food as he rode along, the Portuguese waiter who found a huge tank and filled it with drinking water to make sure Larry and Barbara were adequately hydrated to make it over the Spanish border, the Thai policeman who not only insisted they camp in his walled compound, but also assigned an armed guard to watch over them, and the Germans who refused to let them camp in a snowstorm. Barbara's words bring these characters to life, and her compassion makes them feel real, even when some of her language is, by today's standards, out of date. There is a curiosity and appreciation of all who cross the savage's path that renders Miles from Nowhere the the treasure that it is. A book that remains engaging and interesting 40 years after it was first published. Americans don't really travel, explains Larry Savage. At one point, only 10% of Americans had active passports. Because of this, they don't really think of other cultures. It's just something we see on TV. But everyone is a person, and you're not better than anyone else, you're just different. Putting your expectations or mores on them is a really bad idea. It's almost hard to imagine the Savages' journey today, in an era where Google has mapped the world, where hotel reservations and campsite locations are a click away, where if you develop potentially life-changing symptoms after cycling the cobblestones of Portugal, as Larry did, you can get medical information in mere seconds. We know so much now, and maybe that is part of our problem. Barbara and Larry went into their journey without the vast stores of knowledge we have today, but also without assumptions. The Savages set out to meet the world on bikes that looked old and heavy to us now. They had no lightweight gear, no carbon fiber, and when cold, they cycled in sweatpants. But in other ways, they had everything they needed. In their good-natured openness, they connected with the world in a deep and genuine way that has stood the test of time. Even more than our desire to experience adventures and see the world, wrote Barbara at the close of their trip, it was the people who had kept us going, giving us a home and a family away from home. In preparation for this reissue of Miles from Nowhere, I read everything I could about Barbara and Larry Savage, including a number of reader reviews. I was struck by how many people had read the book multiple times. How many mentioned having 2 copies, one to keep, one to loan out. How many people were inspired to take bicycle trips of their own after reading Barbara's words, and a few who enjoyed the read, but admitted they were definitely not up to the challenge. One woman told of being inspired by reading the book when it first came out, but she had small children at the time. Now, 30 years later, she is embarking on a trip across the U.S. One of the reviews I read was simple. Read this book and went straight out and bought myself a $250 specialized bicycle and started my first bicycle tour. Changed my life. The name attached to this review was familiar to me. Andrew X. Pham, author of Catfish and Mandala, a book published some 20 years after Miles from Nowhere, about Pham's own bicycle journey through Vietnam, an attempt to reconcile his adopted American homeland and the country where he was born. This book went on to win the Kiriyama Prize and the Whiting Award. It was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. Sometimes a good bicycle story can change your life. I know the spirit of Barbara and Larry has infused the cycle trips I've taken, up the coast of Ireland, through the mountains and rice paddies of Japan. On the same U.S. West Coast they traveled. I've tried to be as open as they were in engaging the world, to have more faith in humanity than I have fear of it. Though Barbara's words and stories stand on their own, both intriguing, educational, and often laugh-out-loud funny, they are irrevocably connected to the fact of her death, on her bicycle, shortly before the book was published. It seems impossible to reconcile this engaging young woman and her bright spirit with an early death. It feels a little like losing a friend, or someone you would have wanted to be friends with. I'm not the only reader who has wondered how this couple, who managed to successfully survive such an arduous journey together, could ultimately be separated by fate. I have to believe, however, that Barbara's spirit lives on in all the cyclists and adventurers who have been inspired by her journey, in fellow authors who have written their own travel adventures, in the women who have felt validated or activated by her travels, in the fact that this book, 4 decades later, is still finding readers, still being passed along from hand to hand, still changing lives. Here, read this. I think you'll like it. Tara Austin Weaver. Beware. New Delhi, AP, An American woman cyclist was eaten alive yesterday, some 200 miles southeast of this Indian capital city, by a giant wild ape. News of my death would surely make the headlines in all the big newspapers back home in the US of A. Larry, I hoped, would tell the story right, giving it a sensational and tragic ring, conjuring up a horrifying death race between an innocent woman bicycler and an ape with jaws large enough to inhale an entire human being. If he told it right, there I'd be, pedaling through the starving masses of a primitive country filled with cobras, tigers, and bands of cutthroat thieves, when suddenly a wild, semi-erect primate lunges from its treetop sanctuary and chases me down, killing me with the brutal force of its jaws and limbs. As I watched the ape swing toward me, I prayed that Larry would tell a good story, that he would be kind enough not to tell the truth about the way I was to die. In late November of 1979, there were 3 of us bicycling through India together. Larry and I had met Jeff Thorpe, a blonde-haired, blue-eyed New Zealander in his early 20s, at the campground in New Delhi a few days after we arrived in India. Jeff, too, was headed toward Nepal, and we agreed to travel as a threesome. We were all a bit nervous about bicycling through such a strange and exotic country. The day we set out from New Delhi, I suggested that we take back roads so that we could visit the small Indian villages and farms and avoid the heavy truck traffic on the highways. It took us 5 days to meander our way to the town of Minpuri, 183 miles southeast of New Delhi, and everywhere during that time, crowds gathered to stare at us. In Minpuri, we drew more crowds than anywhere else, probably because we were farther away from the main highways. When we rolled into town, it became immediately evident that Minpuri was not like the other Indian towns we had stayed in. Its streets were so narrow that only one car could pass through at a time. Yet there were no cars, only people, bicycles, rickshaws, motor scooters, and a few sacred cows milling about. Tiny wooden kiosks, large enough to seat 1 or 2 adults, lined the alleys. The kiosks were shops that sold everything from food to textiles to jewelry. No one in the shops spoke English, and the people in the town stared at us more in disbelief than curiosity. Eventually, we scouted out the town doctor, who understood our language, and led us to the only boarding house in Minpuri. I waited with Jeff in the dusty, manure-strewn street while Larry went upstairs with the doctor to get a room. But then, after 2 weeks in this overflowing country of dark-skinned people with their contrasting ivory teeth and penetrating eyes that continually searched our faces for answers to their silent questions, who were we? Why were we here? Where were we going? Where'd we come from? Jeff and I expected the crowds, but we did not expect what was to happen next. Word of our arrival spread instantaneously, and mobs of Indians rushed toward us through the narrow alleyways, oblivious of any obstacles in their paths. Given our foreign appearance and our space-age 15-speed bicycles and equipment, we probably drew as much attention as would a flying saucer. Jeff and I, crushed and jostled by the force of the bodies around us, held onto our bikes and leaned our backs together in an effort to keep ourselves and bikes upright. The Indians on the outside of the crowd clawed and shoved their way forward in an effort to attain a ringside position, but those nearest us ran a tough defense, frantically protecting their prized positions. Some men attempted to climb up the side of the nearby kiosks for an aerial view, but the shopkeepers poked them with the long bamboo poles normally used for swatting at any sacred cows that tried to steal food from the shops. 5 minutes after the mob had begun to swell, a scream, pleading and helpless, slashed through the frenzy of the crowd, like the cry of a drowning child over the pounding surf. Jeff and I glanced about nervously. Because of the force of the bodies pressing against us from all sides, we were unable to move any part of our bodies except our heads. I swung my head around and spotted a rickshaw taxi that had been overturned and trampled by the walls of humanity pouring in from the side streets. The 2 riders, a man and a woman, were caught underneath. but the mob swarmed over the toppled carriage in total disregard of its buried and shrieking occupants. The man who had been pulling the rickshaw behind his bicycle had fallen free. He, too, ignored the trapped couple and abandoned his work to join in the madness. While I surveyed the collage of staring faces jiggling around me and listened to the explosions of shouts and squeals echo through the passageways, I heard Jeff say something behind me. Barb, he stammered. I've gotta go. Both of us were near suffocation and about ready to bolt over the top of our spectators, but Jeff was referring to something else. Barb, I can't hold it any longer, he whispered. After picking up dysentery in Iran or Pakistan, Jeff was no longer very polished at controlling himself, and the picture that flashed in my mind of him losing control of his bowels, right there in the midst of a few hundred unsuspecting Indian onlookers, started me laughing hysterically. The more I laughed, the quieter the crowd became, and the men squeezed in even closer to get a better look at the strange phenomenon before them, a woman laughing. To set eyes on a foreign woman on a bicycle was probably in itself a once-in-a-lifetime experience for the men of Minpuri, but to hear such a woman laugh seemed to fascinate them even more. It was as if the Indians hadn't really expected me to be human, to be capable of speech or laughter. "Okay, you two, we've got a room," Larry hollered from one of the windows on the second floor of the boarding house. His words brought a quick halt to my giggling and Jeff's worries, and the two of us began fighting our way through the sea of human forms between us and the boarding house. We pushed aside scores of men dressed in long white tunics and baggy cotton pants who had taken root to the ground. It took a hard shove to break their trances. Once I'd gotten myself and my bike into the boarding house and upstairs, I closed the shutters on the windows in our room to block out the roar of the crowds below. The floors, walls, and the 5 cots in our room were dirty, filthy by American standards. A rat scurried about the floor, periodically disappearing, then reappearing through the gap between the floor and the bottom of the door. After one of its exits, I stuffed the gap full of dirty socks. There was a functioning ceiling fan in the room, and we turned it on full force and collapsed on the cots. We wanted to take advantage of the fan, because within a few hours all electricity in the town would be transferred for the night to the countryside to run the irrigation pumps on the farms. India was experiencing a severe drought this year. After a few moments, I asked Larry where the toilets were. He frowned, rolled his eyes, then pointed upstairs. 2 floors up, on the roof, I found the only toilet in the boarding house. A bucket. At first, I could not bring my feet to approach it, but after arguing with myself for a while, I situated my body atop the open-air throne and stared over the surrounding rooftops. The bucket was half full and reeked. When I first spied the animal, I wanted to believe that it was either stuffed or on a leash. I wanted to refuse to accept what I was seeing while I squatted over the pail, but my mind would not allow that. I was forced to acknowledge the terrible fact that only a few rooftops away from me and my bucket was a live, unfettered, 4-foot-tall ape, which at that very moment was swinging over the alleys and leaping along cement roofs, straight for me. So this is how I'm to die, I thought to myself. Ever since the day Larry and I first came up with the idea of bicycling around the world, deep down inside, I'd always known I wouldn't make it. The ape was so close now that I was sure it would grab me before I had time to get off the roof. All I could do was hope that neither Larry nor Jeff would ever tell the truth of what was about to happen, that I was attacked and killed by an ape while I was relieving myself in a bucket on a rooftop in India. I opened my mouth to scream, but heard myself shout, "Downstairs! Get back downstairs!" My rational thought processes had finally kicked in, and by reflex reaction, I was on my feet and outdistancing the ape, no doubt setting India's all-time record for the 50-yard dash on the flat and down steps. I sprang into our room and slammed the door behind me. "You know," I muttered to Larry and Jeff after I'd calmed my heartbeat, "this is turning out to be one hell of a first-time bicycle trip." Now, had all of this happened to me at the very beginning of our trip, I am positive I would have called it quits and headed for home that very evening. But by then, after 18 months on the road, Larry and I had come to accept, and at times to thrive on, the bizarre and demanding situations of our journey. While I sat on my cot that evening in Minpuri, I thought about how, although the going was often mentally and physically draining, the longer Larry and I bicycled, the more we craved challenges to our newfound stamina, strength, and self-reliance. As exhausted and shaken as I felt that evening in India, I was still very glad we had set out on our journey. Chapter 1. Before It's Too Late. Bicycle around the world? Because it was such a spur-of-the-moment idea, and because we refused to dwell too long upon the dangers, it had a good chance for survival. It began in early 1977, while Larry and I were eating dinner in our tiny apartment in Santa Barbara. Ever notice how often people say, "I wish I'd done something really exciting and challenging when I was younger, because now I'm too old and don't have much to look back on?" Larry mumbled through a mouthful of potatoes. I nodded my head. "Well, pretty soon we're going to have enough money to make a down payment on a house. But once we do that, we'll be tied down to the monthly payments. And then again, if we don't buy, but instead spend our money on something else, like traveling, we might find ourselves priced out of the market by the time we return." I nodded again, and Larry went on. "But on the other hand, we're both in good physical shape right now, and who knows what'll happen in the next 10 years. One of us might get injured, and then we wouldn't be able to bicycle across America like you've been talking about lately. And as for seeing the rest of the world, the way things are going, who knows how much of it will still be around years from now." A thoughtful silence followed. We both knew the conclusion to Larry's ramblings. It had been building up within us for months now. We were tired of our monotonous, dull security, and we were ready to plan our break. After graduating from the University of California at Santa Barbara in 1973, getting married, working in Spain for a year, and traveling through Europe for a summer, Larry and I had returned to Santa Barbara to settle down, begin our careers, and save money for our own home. We quickly fell into the 8-to-5 work week, Larry as a mechanical engineer, and I as a Spanish-English bilingual welfare worker. And soon, that warm, secure sensation that accompanies a steady job, company benefits, and regular paychecks enveloped our souls. We bicycled to and from work each day. On weekends, we played beach volleyball and backpacked. And every few months, we traveled to San Diego to visit my parents or to San Jose to visit Larry's. But by 1977, both of us had grown restless. I'd developed the traditional welfare worker burnout syndrome, losing my ability to cope with or care about the mountains of paperwork, reams of ever-changing government regulations, and forms, and more forms, and a caseload of 130 demanding clients. Larry felt walled in, sitting at a desk every day designing and redesigning computers. Were we to spend the bulk of our lives toiling at unfulfilling jobs inside sterile office buildings, we wondered? Society kept answering, yes, keep working, buy a house, start a family, save for retirement. And along the way, be sure to pick up a color television, microwave oven, stereo, new car, and an electric knife sharpener. But what about adventure and the outside world? I'd recently attended a slide presentation by a Santa Barbara couple who had pedaled across the United States. Before I'd seen the presentation, if someone had asked me how long it might take to pedal across the continent, I would have figured years. But now I knew it could be done in 3 months or less, and that hundreds of people were doing it each year. I wanted to bicycle across the United States, then fly to Spain and bicycle. Larry was all for that and more. He wanted to visit Egypt. Well, then why stop there?
Sample complete. Ready to continue?